This video is on equilibrium shifts. So we're going to talk about how to do supply and demand shifts together at equilibrium. Okay? So we'll be moving from one equilibrium point to a new equilibrium point when there's a shift in supply or demand. Okay, so the questions will say the market for some good if, and then things happening in that market. Okay, so the first thing we'll do is read the story carefully and identify any shifters if we find them. So I like writing S and D and then have a space where I can write each shifter as I find them. In these stories, there might be a supply shifter and a demand shifter. There might be just a supply shifter or just a demand shifter. So read the story carefully and see if you can identify shifters. So market for cheeseburgers. If cheese, an input, okay, that's important, right? Telling us how they're related, becomes more expensive and more people become vegetarians. Okay, so there's two things going on here. Okay, so cheese and input becomes more expensive. So go ahead and write the shifter for that. Pause if you need to find your shifters. Okay, yeah, it's change in price of input. Okay, so you could do change in price of input, change in price of resource, any of those is fine. Okay, and then demand is change in tastes and preferences. Okay. So we're going to draw supply and demand together. So price, quantity, we title it the name of the good. Okay. Supply, demand. And we are going to put our first equilibrium point, P1, Q1, okay? On the previous graph, we looked at this as PE, price equilibrium, and QE, quantity equilibrium. But pretty much from here on out, when we're doing these shifts, we're going to be moving from one equilibrium point to another equilibrium point. So we can do just P1, Q1, P2, Q2, because those are all equilibrium prices and quantities. But if you wanted to do PE1, QE1, you could totally do that, and that's also correct. Okay, so now we draw the shifts. So go ahead and pause the video, look at your shifters, and then draw those shifts in supply and demand. So remember, if you want supply to decrease, you point an arrow in here. If you want supply to increase, you point an arrow out here. If you want demand to decrease, you point an arrow in here. And if you want it to increase, you point an arrow out here. Okay, so go ahead and pause it and draw the shifts. Okay, so cheese price of input becomes more expensive. It's going to be more difficult to make cheeseburgers. Sorry. So S1 into S2, sideways arrow. Okay. And more people become vegetarian, so fewer people want to buy cheeseburgers. So D1 to D2. Okay. All right, so far that's exactly what we've done before on the supply and demand practice, right? So now what's new is we're going to look at the intersection of S2 and D2. So find that where S2 crosses D2 on your paper. Okay. And then you're going to drop a dot. Okay, the intersection of S2 and D2. All right, so your dots should be, roughly side by side. Okay, so you'll notice the way I've drawn it, it kind of looks like my new equilibrium point is higher than my old equilibrium point, which means that my price, my P2 that comes from there, is a little bit higher than P1. Okay, and then we have Q2, which it looks like is lower than Q1, okay? Right, it's at a smaller quantity. Okay, so now we're going to evaluate how price and quantity change in this situation. So we want to know, because of these changes, how does price and quantity change in this market? So you can either put arrows and things on the side of the graph or have a separate area for P and Q. Some people like doing both, but you need it at least, somewhere, either on the side of the graph or here. Okay, so let's take a look first here at the quantity. So this supply shift of it's more difficult to make cheeseburgers, okay? How would that affect the quantity? Would it make quantity, this alone of it's harder to make cheeseburgers, would that make the quantity go up, down, or stay the same? Down, right? If it's more difficult to make, the quantity would go down. Okay, and then this demand shift alone of people don't want as many cheeseburgers, would that make quantity go up, down, or stay the same? It would go down, right? Because fewer people want to buy cheeseburgers, so the price will go down. Companies have to put them on sale to sell them. And so then companies don't want to make as many cheeseburgers because people just don't want as many, okay? So this supply shift says lower the quantity. This demand shift says lower the quantity. So both curves agree. quantity is going to go down. So we can know for sure that quantity will decrease. So you can put it either here on the axis of an arrow pointing to a smaller quantity, or here in your quantity area. You can do down arrows, you could write decrease. Arrows are nice and easy to read, but you could also write decrease. Okay, and then let's look at price. So this supply shift alone of it's harder to make cheeseburgers, how would that alone change the price? Okay, we can real quick draw the graph of the supply shift alone just in case you're not quite sure what that looks like. Okay, so supply shift alone of it's more difficult to make something, it's always going to have this effect on price and quantity. Okay, so this is S1 into S2, sideways arrow. Okay, so we notice that the quantity goes down, which is what we saw earlier, right? And that we suspected if it's more difficult to make it, the quantity is going to go down. Okay, and then price is going to go up, right? Because it's more difficult to make, and so there's less available, and so your buyers at this higher price aren't willing to buy as many, but that's okay because your sellers aren't able to sell as many. Okay, so the price goes up. Okay, so supply curve shifting in would make price go up. Okay, but then let's think about demand going down. So if less people want to buy cheeseburgers, how would the price change? Yeah, it would go down, right? Because people don't want to buy as many cheeseburgers, so your companies have to put cheeseburgers on sale to sell them. So we'll go ahead and draw that in case you wanted to see how that looks alone. So D1 into D2. Okay. So D1 into D2. Okay. So quantity falls, which is again what we predicted earlier, that if people want to buy less, the quantity goes down. And the price will go down also, Price will go down also. Okay. And that's because people just don't want the burgers as much. Okay. So both shifts agreed quantity goes down. So quantity definitely went down, right? But now they're disagreeing on the price, right? Supply shift says, oh, yep, this decrease in ability to produce is going to make the prices higher, right? While this demand shift says, oh, people don't want it as much, that's going to make the price go down, okay? So this price change we call indeterminate or question mark. Indeterminate, okay, or question mark, right? Or you could write, we don't know, or we have no idea, okay? So here's the thing. The way that I've drawn it, it looks like my P2 is a little bit higher than my P1, okay? But depending on how you drew it, it very well could look like your P1 and your P2 are in the same line, right? Or it might look like your P2 smaller than your P1. That's totally fine, okay? Because you might have drawn your supply shift a little bigger than I did mine, or you might have drawn your demand shift a little bigger than I did mine, okay? And because of those arbitrary differences in how big you drew your shifts, which we weren't told in the story how big the shift should be, since those can change how this price turns out, that means we have no idea how these two changes are going to change the price. So now it might happen that it looks like your dots are in the same line, in which case you would write your second P right next to your first P. Oh, sorry. So it should look like this. So P2, comma, P1. Okay. So even if it looks like they're in the exact same line, you would write your P2 next to your P1, because you still have to have two Ps even if they look like they're in the same line, because these are two different prices. Okay. Right. So you could say, right, indeterminate, we don't know, right? You put a question mark. Okay. The thing we absolutely cannot say about the situation is that the price stays the same. Okay, so even though it might look like the way you drew it, the two dots are in the exact same line and your P1 and your P2 are the same, we don't know that for sure, right? Because to say they're the same would mean that you're saying when the price of cheese rises an amount that you don't know, and more people become vegetarians, but you have no idea how many more people, then the price of cheeseburgers is going to stay exactly the same. Right? But we have no idea about that. You just drew lines on a piece of paper, right? You don't know how the price is going to change. So that's why indeterminate question mark, we don't know. Okay, so when you have just a single shift, so like just a supply shift or just a demand shift like we see here, you know how both quantity and price will change, okay? But anytime you have a shift of both supply and demand happening at the same time, either price or quantity will be indeterminate, okay? One of them will, right? And that's because the two curves will agree about one thing. So in this case, these two curves agree about how the quantity will change, but they're going to disagree about the other. So they disagree about how the price changes in this case, okay? So sometimes they'll agree about the price and then disagree about the quantity. So then this will be what's indeterminate and this will be what's known. And we'll do one of those examples at the end. Okay, good job, team. All right, next shift is the market for shirts if a shirt factory is bombed. Okay, so go ahead and pause this, write out your shifters. Okay, supply shifter is change in political disruptions, or you could just write political disruptions. Political disruptions. Okay, political disruptions, okay. And there's no demand shifter. All right, so this shirt factory is now out of commission, but there's still other shirt factories, right? But because this shirt factory is out of business, or at least, not able to produce at the moment, that is going to affect the total number of shirts that could be produced, right? Okay, so supply is going to shift in. So S1 to S2, arrow shift in, okay? So go ahead and find your prices and quantities, your P1, Q1, P2, Q2. Pause the video if you need to. Okay, so this is our first equilibrium point. This is our second equilibrium point. So you do Q1, P1, Q2, P2. Okay, so P1 comes from the intersection of S1D, and Q2 comes from the intersection of S2 and D. Okay, so you have the new quantity and new price. Okay, so there's only one shift, so we're going to be able to know how both price and quantity change. Let's think about this a little bit. So this is how we're going to draw this. Well, okay, we'll do the price and quantity first, and then I'm going to show you kind of a cool thing. Yeah, okay, so how do price and quantity change? Go ahead and fill those in. Okay, so pause the video if you need to. All right, so price is going to rise, and you can either do it on the side of your graph or here, okay? And then quantity is going to fall. Okay. Quantity is going to fall. All right, and that's always the case when supply shifts in. Price goes up, quantity goes down, and that makes sense, right? If it's harder to make things now, the price goes down price goes up, quantity goes down. Okay, so let me show you something you'll never have to draw, but is explaining how this adjustment happens in a way that might be super helpful for understanding how equilibrium shifts happen. Because right, this just goes from before the bombing everything was fine, to after the bombing, everything is also fine. It's just shirts are a little more expensive and there aren't quite as many available as before. But it requires a little explaining how that happens, how that works out. So let's take a look. Okay, so initially we have a certain amount of shirts being made at a certain price and everything is fine and dandy, right? But then, oh no, shirt factory gets bombed. Disaster. Okay, so now the supply of shirts is less, right? Because at least this one factory is out of commission. Okay, so the price doesn't change immediately, right? Remember we talked about when how a price gets changed in equilibrium, right? How it only happens when a seller notices something is wrong with the price, right? When the seller notices, oh wow, people are buying more than I expect, and so I should adjust the price, or people are buying less than I expect, I should adjust the price. So in this case, at this price, but now this factory being burned down, instead of having this many shirts available, now the sellers that are left, right, the shirt factories that are not blown up, are at this price willing to produce, are willing to produce this number of shirts. So where this price hits the supply curve, we have quantity supplied. Sorry, QS, quantity supplied. Okay, so this is the quantity supplied at that price with the new supply curve, okay? And the demand curve hasn't changed. So we take that price, we hit the demand curve to get the quantity demanded, okay? So at this old price with a new supply curve, this is our quantity supplied, this is our quantity demanded. And so we have a gap between them, right? And what do we call that gap? When the price is too low and so people want to buy more than the sellers want to sell. Yeah, we call that a shortage. Good. So this is a shortage. And so the sellers of shirts are going to feel, wow, people are wanting to buy a lot more shirts than we want to make at this price, and they're selling out really fast, right? So then what do the sellers do to fix that problem? Excellent. Yeah, they raise the price. Good. So as they raise the price, the buyers say, okay, shirts are a little more expensive than they were before. I might buy fewer shirts than I would otherwise, right? I'm going to cut back a little bit on shirts, okay? And so that lowers the quantity demanded, which is good, okay? And at the higher price, the sellers of shirts whose factories were not bombed are going to say, oh, hey, we could hustle and make some more shirts and make more money, right? Because as the price goes up, that means the amount of money per shirt increases, and so it's more appealing for them to make shirts than it was before. So they're going to hustle and make more shirts. Okay, so the consequence is the quantity supplied increases, okay? And so at this new equilibrium price of P2, we have a new equilibrium point, all right? A new, what we'll call Q2, right? So that's our quantity, our new equilibrium quantity where supply and demand come together, right? So remember, what two things are equal in equilibrium? Pause it if you need to look it up. Yeah, quantity supplied and quantity demanded. Okay, so I will never have you draw that, but just know that's what's happening when we draw this. Okay. Cool. All right, so then market for masks if masks become subsidized and people start making more money. So go ahead and pause this, do your supply and demand shift, and then draw your graph with shifts and everything. Okay, if you didn't pause it and do all that, do that right now, because otherwise I'm going to show you how it's done and you're not going to get the practice. Okay, supply shifter, masks become subsidized, okay? So that's change in subsidy, okay? So remember, subsidy is a reverse tax. So instead of the company having to pay for producing a product like they do with the tax, the company gets extra money from the government for having produced and sold a product, okay? And then people start making more money, that's change in income. Okay, so anytime we use the change in income shifter, we have to think about if this good is a normal good or an inferior good, okay? So it doesn't tell us in the story. If it did tell us in the story, then we'd go with that, obviously, right? But it doesn't tell us, so we're gonna just think about this, right? If people's incomes go up, would they wanna buy more masks or less? They probably want more, right? It's kind of handy to have more masks, right? So masks are probably a normal good. So you always write which one you assumed next to your shifter so that I can give you all the points you deserve. So PQ masks, supply, demand. We could do our first equilibrium point, Q1, P1. Great. Okay. Great. So the subsidy, which means producers are going to be more excited to make this than before. Yeah, so we can imagine that this didn't happen during this pandemic, but we could imagine that the government might say, oh, not enough producers are making masks. We should put a subsidy in place so that it makes it more appealing for producers to make more masks, right? As we saw during this pandemic, companies were plenty eager to make masks and customers were plenty eager to buy them. So there was no problem getting plenty of masks provided through the market without government intervention. But we could imagine that that's something that would happen. Okay, and then incomes rose. Okay, yeah, so that's not what happened during the pandemic, but it could, right? And if it did, it'd be change in income. Okay, and people would be able to buy more masks. Okay, cool. All right, so then we find our new equilibrium point. So we look at the intersection of S2, D2. We drop a dot. Okay, and that's our Q2, and then we dot it over. And it looks like my P2 and P1 are about in the same line, but remember you need two separate P's, a P1, comma P2, even if they're in the same line, okay? And then we need to show how P and Q are changing. So supply shift says it's easier to make masks, increase the quantity, right? Demand shift says people want more masks, increase the quantity. So we're sure quantity goes up. This supply shift, if it's easier to make masks because they're subsidized, would make the price do what? Shout it out. Yeah, it'd make the price go down, right? The sellers are more willing to make it, so the price would go down. Okay, and then people start making more money. How would that change the price? So that would increase the price because people are more excited about buying masks, and so they would drive the price up with their greater demand. So, in consequence, the price change is indeterminate, so question mark or indeterminate, and we could do a separate area for the P and Q if you wanted that. I'm kind of running into my other space here, but price indeterminate, quantity increase, okay? Okay, good. So the price was indeterminate this time just like it was the time before, because the curves are shifting the same direction, but in a little bit we'll have one where the curves are shifting opposite directions, so quantity is indeterminate. But just know that either price or quantity could be indeterminate. All right, market for goods from Target if the prices at Walmart fall. So go ahead and pause your video, do your shifters, and draw the graph with the shifts. Okay, so goods from Target if the prices at Walmart fall. So we have to think about how Target and Walmart are related, or like goods from Target related to goods from Walmart. Okay, so goods from Target are substitutes to goods from Walmart, so we have change in price of substitute. Okay, so you could write change in price of related good, and that would give you 1 point. But the story doesn't tell us that they're substitutes, so you have to write somewhere that they're substitutes. So you could write change in price of related good and then write substitute next to it. That would be fine, okay? But you do have to have substitute written somewhere. Okay, and then there's no supply shift, okay? Nothing that changes the ability of Target to make its goods. Okay, so we title this goods from Target. Goods from Target. We have a supply and demand curve. Okay. We have Q1, P1. And okay, so now the prices at Walmart fall. Okay. So people will want to buy more goods from Walmart. That's just going to be a change in quantity demanded. Okay. But that means people are going to go to Walmart more because it's cheaper, and so they're going to go to Target less. Okay, so goods from Target are going to see a decrease in demand. So D1 to D2, arrow in. And now we have Q2, P2. Okay, so here's the thing. Whether we drew this demand shift really small or really big or really, really big, it'll always be the case that the quantity goes down and the price goes down. Okay, so that's why this is determinate. This is why we know both price and quantity are going to go down. Because whether you draw your demand shift big or small, it's going to make both go down. Whereas here, if you draw your supply shift bigger than your demand shift, then it would look like your second equilibrium point is lower than your first, and so then it would look like your price is lower, but that was just arbitrary, right? So that's why the price is indeterminate there. All right, last one. Market for peanut butter if the price of bread rises and there's a great peanut butter harvest this year, right? So lots more peanuts than normal are harvested because maybe the weather was perfect for it. Okay, so go ahead and pause the video and write your shifters and draw your graph. Okay, so price of bread rises. Okay, so when you think about how are peanut butter and bread related, okay? So they are complements. They're goods that go together. So that's a demand shift or change in price of complements. Okay. You could have written change in price of related good complement, okay, but make sure complement's in there because it didn't tell us how they are related, so you have to write the assumption. Okay, and there's a great peanut harvest. That's change in elements of nature, or you could just write elements of nature. Elements of nature. Okay, and then we draw the graph. Peanut butter. Oh, just kidding, guys. You guys are probably shouting at me as you're watching this video. So elements of nature is not the best shifter for this one, actually. Okay, I might give credit for the shifter, but it's not the best one because it's an elements of nature shift for peanuts. But is peanuts the good that we're looking at? No, we're looking at peanut butter, right? So for peanut butter, what's actually a better shifter? Yeah, change in price of resource or change in price of input, because peanuts are a resource for peanut butter. So your peanut butter producers are going to feel like, or are going to see, oh, wow, peanuts are cheaper this year. They don't necessarily know why. They don't care, right? But what they know is, oh, wow, peanuts are cheaper. That's awesome, right? So change in price of input is actually a better shifter. Change your price of input. Okay, or change in price of resource. Okay, great. So supply, demand. That's why it's so important to write the title as the name of the good, because I only realized that I made a mistake on that by writing this and realizing, oh, wait, this supply shifter that I was thinking about isn't the supply shifter for this good, it's for a different good. So that's why it's so important to write the title, the name of the good, because then you'll realize, oh, wait, I'm doing something not with what the good that I'm supposed to be doing things with. All right, so P1, Q1. Okay, so now it is easier to make peanut butter because the peanuts are cheaper, and the price of bread rises, so people want less peanut butter to go with their bread. Okay, so poor peanut butter never did anything wrong, but people do not want as much of it because bread's expensive. Make sure all of your labels and your supply and demand and arrows are on the right side of the graph, because if you put your labels over here or over here, I won't see them, and so I won't be able to give you points for them. Because when I'm checking the graphs, right, I have 200 8th graders, so I'm going to be checking these graphs really quickly, right? And so I'm only going to be looking at this part for those labels, okay? And if you put an arrow in the middle here, it's not going to be clear which line you're talking about, and so you also won't get points for that, okay? So make sure everything you want me to check about the arrows and the S's and D's is in this area of the graph. Okay, so then S2, D2, S2, D2, P2, and Q2, okay? So as I drew it, it looks like a Q2 is maybe a tiny bit bigger than Q1, okay? But we'll think about this. So supply shift says the quantity should go up, yeah, right? It's easier to produce it, quantity should go up. Okay, demand shift, if people want it less, says quantity should go down. Yeah, people want it less. So the quantity is indeterminate here. Supply shift says increase quantity, demand shift says decrease quantity, and we don't know which wins. So we would write question mark or indeterminate, okay? And then for the price, it definitely decreases, right? Because if it's easier to produce, the price would go down. And if people want it less, the price would go down. So definitely price goes down. All right, great job, guys. You're awesome.